everyone. Welcome to another exciting episode of the DevLogue Podcast, where we dive deep into everything related to software development. We're all about figuring out how to make development processes better, especially by using AI and data-driven strategies. I'm your host, Henry, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Emil. How are you doing, Emil?
Hey, good afternoon, Henry. I'm doing awesome. I'm super excited to be here for our 5th episode now of the DevLogue Podcast.
Same here. And today we have a special guest joining us, Patrick Cullen. Pat is the CTO of YearOne. YearOne aims to be a platform that combines career development, data insights, and best practices to help engineers grow. Pat, it's great to have you here. Can you start by sharing a bit about yourself and your journey from being an engineer to becoming a senior engineering leader and now a fractional CTO at YearOne?
Yeah. Great to be here. I want to start by saying I appreciate the platform you guys are setting up. And in spaces like this podcast, there's just so many things that just aren't Googleable. So the more information we can share, the better that we can be as a collective. So thank you for that. That's a big question. So yeah, my journey started in an economic recession, that last one back in 2009, where I had to do a lot of things like fix laptops while passing Sun certifications back when that was actually still a company on the weekends to finally get my foot in the door in the software engineering role. That saw me through various companies. One of them ended up being through a consulting firm that while I was working at GE as a contractor. And that firm had the opportunity, based on generating enough revenue, to bootstrap a startup. And they said, hey, we want you to build the app. And I didn't think twice. I said, sure, let's go for it. So I did that solo. My pair programmer was Stack Overflow. And I built everything wrong, stuffed the relational database into MongoDB, did some good things along the way. But that really built a mentality for me into like execution mindset and driving fast and taking chances. From there, I realized I was making a lot of mistakes and then joined a local engineering company or product company called Commerce Hub that's in the e-commerce space in upstate New York. They've now rebranded to be called Rhythm because the majority of the user groups in the area were all driven by engineers at this company. So I knew this was a place I could learn. And luckily I was right. I learned a ton, slowly worked my way up through engineering leadership roles and managing teams and managing managers. And then that ultimately led me to move across the country and join another startup called Carrot, where I joined as employee number 8 back in the earlier days of the company in 2018. And I stayed there through just 4 or 5 months ago as their top line of technology, SVP of engineering as my title, which was an amazing journey. So fun to grow an engineering team from 3 to 70. And once again, of course, many mistakes along the way, but also a lot of great wins. And then that brings me to today, where I've moved into more of a transitionary period where I've exploring several fractional leadership roles, especially operating as CTO of YearOne, as well as dabbling with a couple of product ideas on my own on the side, of course, related to AI, because who's not? But that journey has been so fun with the pendulum swinging on so many different ways of where I was focusing at the time. And honestly, in the last 6 months, I've probably written more code than the last 2 or 3 years. So that's also fun too, because that's kind of why we all get into it in the first place.
Is your pair programmer still Stack Overflow, or like at this generation, I guess some AI copilot stuff?
It's funny, right? So I still pair program with some people, and AI is definitely the go-to. So for me, I've seen a lot of success with GitHub Copilot, but I've actually been using Cursor, which kind of just is a wrapper that takes over this code. Verdict's out on whether or not forcing me into that IDE is the best thing or not. I'm also a JetBrains fan as well, so that's a little painful. But when pair programming with actual humans, I'm probably the one that's most frequently still referring to a Stack Overflow because it may be harder to find the answer, but when you do, the hit rate is definitely much higher. So taking that extra 5 minutes, it's an art to know when to do that versus just continually riffing with AI along the way. I'm still a Stack Overflow fan.
Pat, I'm curious. So, and thanks for kind of letting us know about your career journey, right? Going from engineer to leader of managers, CTO, and now the fractional. Just out of curiosity, what led you to today? You're going down the fractional route, fractional CTO, and then how did you come across that, and how does that fit kind of into your career journey and where you want to go in the future? Talk a little bit about that, because I'm seeing that
Yeah.
more, across different roles. Now I'm seeing the fractional CRO, and now we're seeing the fractional CTO, CMOs. So talk to us a little bit about that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, totally. I think that probably an aspect of my exposure there came from engineering network I am a part of, along with some others, called 7 CTOs. And that experience kind of just like opened me up to how that would operate, like what the opportunity could be in the nature of creating flexibility within what a forced 40-hour work week looks like within like just a single career operations. So I think as humans, probably like anyone listening to this podcast, you probably have an idea at all times, some idea, something you want to build. And that can be tricky. And if you can find yourself in a position where you've built a strong enough network to have that array of opportunities that you can deploy, your decade worth of knowledge on engineering leadership in a time a little bit less allocated than 40 hours a week, you can take that additional time to still build something else without having to go all in on like a VC funded startup that has all of those other constraints with it. And I really like the idea of the bootstrap approach. So I think that's probably the biggest driver. I like the flexibility of it all. That being said, I am like also operating full time at YearOne right now because, they have such exciting things going on that I felt it prudent. We all felt it prudent for me to be putting in that much effort to see them through this next iteration of their journey.
I want to follow up on that. So when you onboard yourself as a fractional CTO on a large engineering org, what are some common challenges that you see, when you get to know the team and then help them address?
Well, to be transparent, the fractional roles that I've engaged are not large enough to have that level of concern. Even at like teams that get just into like teams of teams. So if you're talking double digit engineers, dozen to 20, still at that level, I've found that I have a knack for lack of a better term, vertical athleticism in being able to quickly grok what's going on from the leadership level and the IC level. So I haven't had to integrate with something that has the complexity of which it's impossible for me to get my hands all around it individually, and I need to be abstracted to some levels. And I think the root of what you're asking would come in probably closer to nearing or more size engineering org for me, maybe 60s, 70s at the earliest. But I tend to have a strong knack for getting my hands around a pretty complex set of technology and team dynamics.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I guess just the same question, but applied to team of, double digit team, like 10, 20, 30 developers. When you work with those engineering teams, how do you get started, to get familiar with the team, know the team, and then help the team, accomplish their goals?
Yeah. So it's an interesting question because it's so relative to the scenario or situation you find yourself in. So when I think about familiarity with teams in Carrot's journey, I had the advantage of always having more context than basically anyone else there, given how long I had been at the company. So that's one type of engagement where there's been plenty of times where there's been facets of decoupling or recoupling technology or reporting teams where I've taken things over. And I think one of the more notable was the evolution of our business intelligence and data science and data engineering teams. So with that engagement, and also shout out to Jasmine, our amazing senior director who's still at Carrot, what we did was started with I recommend starting with, unless there is like an edict of a specific thing that needs to happen in a short period of time, then the best thing I found is starting from a more reactive servant leader mentality and coming from a place of curiosity. From there, what I've done is provide artifacts of opportunities to the leader that tends to taking like that next tier from me. Like Jasmine in this example, like, hey, I've heard these styles of symptoms. So here are some approaches we've taken to strategy that you could fold in and use this as a reference document. Or here are some approaches to team structures. Here's some approaches to ticket management. Here's some approaches to code reviews. And then from now, I've gotten to the point where I'm not prescribing, but I'm unlocking access to the ecosystem and community around them. The next step tends to be connecting horizontally. So still, I'm trying whenever possible not to push down like needs, but provide context for them to want, I think should be the next thing, which is generally some business objective. So the next opportunity there, as long as I've set that path correctly, is to then connect teams of teams that I'm already working with or have worked with so that they can help each other more from a peer perspective. All of that tends to be it's all under the mentality of invite over inflict. And so the more I can just encourage whoever's working with me, use all of the resources around them, the more likely I am for them to tell me that they want to do exactly what I'm thinking without me having to tell them specifically that thing,
Sure.
if that makes sense.
Yeah. So just to follow up your comment on the artifacts is interesting. So when you talk about artifacts, is it more like ideas that you bring to the table, or is it deeper? And so you're providing ideas, but you're also providing like deliverables or products or examples of frameworks that you've used in the past of what good looks like that can be then modified at the current organization? Or is it physical deliverables that you're handing them to them along with the idea?
It is, the majority of it is process artifacts. So it's two layers. It is the deliverables it could be the deliverables along the way that were contained within that process. Let's get specific. It's not likely to be like referencing of a coded product, like a piece of software, but it's more likely to be referencing, hey, check out these epics that have these Jira tickets that have these code contributions. Or more notably, it's usually things like check out these Confluence pages, or check out, I'm a big fan of asynchronous comms through video. So the more you do that, the more then you can say, hey, check out these 2 Loom videos. They're 5 minutes each. And they'll give you all the context you need from when that team was working on it. Things like that. So diagrams, wiki pages, videos. I think that's like the top 3. And it's usually exhaust from the process. And it's not actually, and sometimes it can be like the overarching, like this is the way we do things documents. But for the most part, I find that my attempts at establishing evergreen documentation for that kind of stuff is almost always stale by the time I give it to someone else. So then it's like, well, here's something, but here's 15 caveats on why it doesn't make sense anymore. But if I give them like the material, tangible exhaust of things that use that process along the way, it's more specific, but in some ways it's also then you understand what to and not to take out of it. Where an evergreen item looks like you're almost trying to prescribe a process.
So Pat, I really like your approach of, coming from a place of curiosity and then providing these artifacts and log, direct reports potential and gently steer the direction of where team is going. So I was curious, when you lead engineering team, how do you ensure the team remains productive and healthy? Do you have any strategies that you use to gain visibility into the team status?
Yeah. This is another one where I probably stretch beyond someone's comfort zone at a like a 50-person level. But until we got to somewhere between 40 and 50 indirect reports totaled reporting through me, I actually still did a skip level at least quarterly with every single person. And then anyone that was like at a minimum of like a senior IC level, that was maintained at a monthly level. So that's like like this. So like theme one is bottom up. I don't know, like IC up information radiation. And what are your techniques there? So skips. And if you're not doing skips, then the next step I did there is you have cascading skips with roll up summarization. So, okay, I can't do skips with this group. So I have a director in place. That director is accountable towards skips at a similar cadence or an alternative strategy that the two of us agree on, such that they can jot down some key notes. And then in our like leaders of leaders sessions that I had weekly, where it was just like a round table of topics, there would be a recurring monthly that said, what are your insights from your round of skips that just should have happened? That's like approach one, which is if you can have non-structured protected space with going around their direct report, you're going to get information of symptoms that you might not have, like you probably got exposed to, but you didn't realize the volume of the concerns of different areas that you should focus further into, or what things are going well. We all get to like leadership roles because we like to try to fix and improve things. So we're always focused on the things that could be going better. So that's thing one. Keeping on that theme though is surveys. It's every team, once you get to that size, should have some form of survey, and you can start extremely simple on these and they can get extremely complex. But like you can, if you don't even know where to start on a survey, you could just like Google search Dorometric surveys, something like that. And that's going to give you at least a first round of something that's probably pretty quick. You can download. It's probably like 5 questions on a Likert scale, 1 to 5. How do you relate to these questions? And then just make sure you let them have some free form text. And that just gets it's hopefully at a different cadence than your skips. So it's like you're getting people at a different point in time because we all have recency bias. And it's a more data-driven approach to how things are going. So that would be number 2. That evolves over time. If you've got a really solid people ops, HR org, however you call it in your companies, then they probably have some level of some sort of engagement survey that you should be coalescing and potentially aligning with. But there's no way that survey is going to ask the specific questions that are more helpful to engineers. If you have a product-minded organization and you have product-minded engineers, you're going to want to be asking them questions like how easy or like how well do you understand the value of the product that you're building and what it's supposed to be doing for your customers on a scale of 1 to 5, and then have them write notes there. Like, oh, we have a gap where that was too low because they've been too project oriented, but they don't even know how it's going to be used. And that sounds silly, but it actually happens more often because communication is hard. So that's bottoms up. You combine that, of course, then with metrics. So you're getting some metrics there, right? Like a survey is a set of metrics, but then there is a series of other metrics from some of your core tools that allow you space to have a conversation with added data-driven context, whether that's information from the surveys or a repository activity or a ticket activity. Those would probably be like the top 3, but the more data you can get, the better. If you can go beyond that, there's anything that helps tell you a story of how activity is moving is going to be valuable. So even those 3, you can really approach those in a very fine-grained, very different way, depending on how your organization is structured. And then I'd say the last is also depending on your management team structure. You should have some structure in place for them to tell you how their teams are doing. So they, simple things like green, yellow, red, as far as how they perceive team health to be at their level, because they have their own context. And then the same should be communicated through to them, because you as a leader also have a unique perspective on how well they're executing in relation to this complex ecosystem within the organization. And that should be in collaboration. So let's say you're a cross matrix organization where you have a product counterpart, then that should be in combination, opting for as much transparency as possible as how well you and the org are perceiving the balance of quality and execution on their teams, and how it's being perceived throughout the organization from your perspective.
So Pat, just wanted to double click on what you talked about with the skip level meetings. So how do you structure those, or what's your approach to those so that they're valuable, that you're creating that harmonious culture with the person that you're chatting with, so that it doesn't come across as too big brotherly it doesn't come across in a way where the direct manager in between is going to get defensive. Just curious, how do you approach those? Like, do you use an agenda? Do you have the individual come to the meeting with the agenda? Is it more open? Is it more free form? How do you be just interested? What's your best practice or approaches to conducting those so that they're most valuable?
Yeah. If you build the right culture, then the culture builds that for you. So
Right.
in my situation, how did that actually unfold? Because the skips led to, so there's not some like formal edict that says like, this is how I'm going to operate. But because the skips led to me focusing on actionable things that the managers found valuable that I was deriving from them, it created a positive reinforcement loop. By simply taking thoughtful action, I didn't really need to create too much more structure beyond establishing the skip. At some point, what I did, because as we got to, I'd say like 24 engineers, being modest at this, I was undervaluing the intimidation factor of it all,
Right.
because it's like you're getting to the side, it's like, oh gosh, this is a meeting with Pat. I've only said hello to him once or twice in the last few months because of the decoupling of layers directly in a one-on-one setting. The next thing I did was I like structured a little bit to say like I even had a video, because Loom again saying like, hey, like you don't have to come to these with anything. I have like a grab bag I can use, and here's what I might say. And then at the same time, one of our senior engineers, she helped spearhead another page in our wiki that said like, hey, you might be scared about this upcoming one-on-one with Pat or eventually directors. Here's how I approach them. And here's some of the questions I ask myself before the meeting to try to think about relevant topics that I believe will create value. So then you kind of had this like top down, like, hey, like I promise, like we can talk about rich roll the whole time and how in triathlons or whatever, if that's fine. The latest Olympic trials results, who cares? It's fine. It's totally fine. Or, you can have particular agenda items. And I absolutely got both of those. And that's completely fine.
I want to dig deeper into that. So how would you characterize like a very good, conversation one-on-one with a skip, or like what kind of information do you want to get out of it?
It's a good question, because even a skip, like I said, literally talks about sports or trends of like social media for 20 minutes. Like that's okay. Like I mean, geez, there were several skips where I spent the entire time explaining how stock options work, because they just didn't quite have that level of like I don't understand how this thing works at our company. Like, oh yeah, okay. So like, disclaimer, but here's how I think about it. And even that's just like I'm sure that reduces a sense of concern from a financial perspective, and that's fine. That's valuable. When I try to be like directly selfish, then actually my favorites were when it's not that they brought a topic, it's when they asked a question and it was very clear, like through 2 minutes, like it could be a 15-minute but like the first 2 minutes, it was already evident to me that like there's a lot underneath this question, and there's opportunities here. There's deficiencies in certain areas that like maybe everything's kind of moving fine, but this person has experienced that thing we've probably all experienced at some point in our career, where like predictability is fine, but you can just tell things are moving slower like than they were 6 months ago, 1 year ago, and we're still predictable and everybody seems to be kind of fine with it, but like why are we going so slow? Why, like we added so many controls, or we like some retro led to us adding this constraint, so we had to double check, and all of these things made sense at the time, but now it feels like we're iterating in molasses. And I like those usually start from this like innocent question about a particular like strategy of quality that they're not convinced is adding the quality we expect it, but it is impacting velocity.
Totally. I strongly resonate with what you just said. Sometimes I just enjoying the conversation, as just a human, not as an engineer. And then sometimes, we'll have some thought-provoking questions from the engineers, and then really can help surface some of the issues. So I want to take this opportunity to also circle back to the second approach you mentioned, which is more data-driven. It's like a DORA survey that you get from direct reports as well as your skips. How does that DORA survey work? Do you get like drastically different numbers for estimates from different people? And how do you use that information to drive improvements?
Yeah. Yeah. You're definitely going to get different numbers because somebody's going to use the system to communicate stronger, right? So you're talking about, I have confidence in the quality of my change going out to production safely. Some question in that form. Somebody's going to put a 2 on there because they're really uncomfortable with the level of like test coverage or automation. And then they'll add a comment that like explains it further. So you might have something like a 4.2 out of 5 with a couple outliers. So you should always opt for anonymity whenever people provide those, but give them the option to be more specific. So in those cases, if they list a team, then you can have an opportunity to talk with that team. So you're definitely getting some varying numbers with those, and that's fine. I would caution against the value of the first survey. Say you roll this out in your organization, like I should do that, and you Google search it and you roll that out. I would wait, unless it's something rather drastic or apparent. I'd probably wait till the results of the second one to start to see what kind of like, was there any trend changes? Are there themes that started to show up? Like a three or a 4 out of 5 might actually be okay if it resonates with what you're trying to optimize for. Well, 4 is definitely okay. I think if you're doing a 5-point scale and you're seeing 4s, like the goal is not 5s. Like, especially if you have people like me on the team, like I don't put 5s because I always think there's some opportunity to be slightly better, and a 4 is great. Yeah. So I don't know if that actually hit towards your question or if there's a follow up there.
Oh yeah.
So the second survey is that the same survey as the first, and you're just measuring if there's any changes, or
Yeah. You want to keep it pretty close to similar so that you can and it starts to create calibration and like drift over time. So if you see a reduction in a number, to me, that's more valuable than the objective number per se. There's value in both, but I want to start seeing how they trend over time.
And what's the delta in time between the two surveys? Like, how do you account for, well, if I filled out a survey today and then I filled out the exact same thing a week later, I'm going to have different responses, right? Just because it's been a week, right? Not that anything has changed in the interim, but just depends on like that day or how I'm feeling. I'm going to have different responses. How do you account for that so that you're really measuring the improvement or a decrease?
Yeah. There is always noise, but we actually go for quarterly. These kind of things take time. Like if you ask like how was your testing quality like once a week, like that's just going to become mind numbing, and people aren't going to even pay attention. They're just going to start filling it out with 5s because they can't even be bothered anymore, and they don't even want to have a conversation about it. But if you put it at a cadence, most notably, even though I'm saying even on the first survey to be a little wary of what actions you take, you need to take some action because you need to show that there is value in something happening from the result of what they've taken the time to give you. Even if you think there isn't any actions, explaining to them why you think there shouldn't be actions based on the results you're seeing is an action. And that's okay too. And like creating space for that. But like if you do nothing with the survey, then that's a feedback loop that's going to also deteriorate your data.
Cool. Do you have like maybe 3 key questions that you usually ask in this kind of survey? And then related to that, what are some metrics that you really care about?
Yeah. Let me think about some of my key questions. Let me pull up some of my old questions. So I didn't give strong wording, and some of these, like I said, originally came from surveys, but if you're asking, like, here's an example of a structure and a format, and I didn't invent this. Literally Likert scale questions, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on strong negative or strong positive experience. How is your experience with building your service or your services on your team? So is building a clear, repeatable task? Is it fast enough? What happens when the build fails? Are failures easy to diagnose? How long does it take to validate something in a build in a local environment? That would be a question. Just to go in a completely different direction. So there's several that you can ask on that. You can like replace the word build with test, replace the word test with deploy, replace the word deploy with operate, right? Get into the DevOps mentality. So like for an operate question, like always adding more context of follow-up questions like are your logs and information accessible and easy to find? Is it easy to correlate data flows across systems, across teams for what you're trying to operate? Is it easy to debug if the logs don't tell you the story? Like, how easy is it to reproduce whatever you've experienced in a deficiency during operation of whatever services you're running in production? To go a different way, it might be something a little bit more objective oriented, like how satisfied are you with the clarity of task or project goals on your team? Same idea, scale of 1 to 5. So having a mix of like the first few I was referencing are a little bit more Dora minded. And then that last one's going to be a little bit more of just like cross matrix product organization effectiveness.
Makes sense. So sort of like designing the questions to cover different phases of the software development lifecycle, as well as the satisfaction side of things from developers. So when you debug, let's say you have the deployment frequency metric from your developers, and then it doesn't look right. Maybe it's not as high or as frequent as you want it to be. How would you drill down and then start debugging this metric and then figuring out what's the actions to take?
Yeah, and it gets more nuanced, I think is the right word than that too. There's multiple layers here, and there's such high risk of gamification. So let's talk about a situation, and then I'll explain how that situation's kind of contrived and what actually happened. So you can have a situation, a team feels, actually, no, I'll start with the data, because what the team feels and what led to it, you find out later because the data shows itself first. So you identify that there is a deployment frequency that is drastically reduced on a team over the last several weeks. And that might be okay, right? Maybe the team is swarming on a discovery phase that says like, we really need to be thoughtful, but it's been several weeks. And so you've noted it and you're saying, hey, your deployment frequency on this team of 5 people went down 2 per day to 3 total last week across all of you. Is everything okay? What's going on? And you're talking most notably, if it's me, then I'm talking with, let's say I am just a manager of managers in that situation, not the director layers at that time. Then you're having that conversation with the manager, because you do not, as that manager of managers, you have data and you're seeing that. And maybe you have some inklings, but like in this scenario, let's assume I don't, then it's a conversation with that manager. And right away, that manager is probably going to be like, oh, it's because of this and that, and this makes complete sense. Or yes, this is something we've been kind of talking about in one-on-ones, that we're getting the sense that like we're bundling too much on the product side into one major release. So that kind of conversation then tends to lead to an escalation of like iterative value delivery, challenging questions on somebody in every company at some point will always have the opinion that if they bundle these 10 things together into one release, it's going to be so much faster than if you try to iterate, because every iteration has to figure out the shims with whatever the old thing was to make them work in production until the whole thing's out. But if you just do it all at once, you don't have to worry about that transitionary state. And almost every time that's a bad idea, because the larger the change set, the more all of our metrics have shown that you're probably going to break something, and you have no learnings along the way that all of these assumptions you made are actually valuable. So that tends to lead to hard conversations about iterative UX strategies. You have to be pragmatic on like how long they'll be out there to help that team transition. And that would be an example of a deployment frequency leading to a conversation of which potentially might have been escalated to you once already, to be fair. I've had plenty where I'm like, hey, what's going on here now? And they're like, yeah, I remember that. Remember how I mentioned that like lightly 2 weeks ago? And I was like, oh, okay. Yep. This makes a lot more sense now. I'm sorry that I didn't focus on it enough with you 2 weeks ago. And then that leads to probably a cross-functional collaboration on like, hey, how do we unlock this bottleneck that we're currently experiencing? In reality, it can get way more. And this goes back to like those 3 data sets are great, but in reality, in that example, what's happening a lot of times is something like the deployments are still there, but it's feature flagged off. And you start to have this large chunk of code that is hidden behind a feature flag. So you need to complement it with things like you have to be aware of how your organization truly operates and make sure that you have an effective, collective, cohesive ecosystem of visibility into that. So in that example, you probably want another thing that has monitoring on long-lived feature flags. And if something is out there in production and it's been feature flagged for, I don't know, over 4 weeks, maybe then you should annotate the fact that you know why it is or don't know, and you need to look into it. And that should complement something like deployment frequency.
Yeah. I think it comes down to understanding the context of the metric, either through like conversation you mentioned, or through other automatic monitoring, like number of feature flags that are currently hidden. Yeah, this is awesome. I want to pivot and then ask more about the going back to the cursor and AI conversation that we had. So besides cursor that you are using as your IDE, is there any other like AI tools that you recently experimented with that you find useful or helpful for yourself or for your teams?
Yeah, I like insert your standard LLM product here. Like, do not undervalue the use of the Anthropics and OpenAIs of the world and just literally using their model straight up. One example that can be pretty interesting there is we're doing some interesting work at YearOne to derive insights on qualitative information of the data that is written in text form. And if you can drive some of that through AI, let's say commit messages, you can actually learn some insights on correlating trends that are being contained within a commit message that something like a generative AI can expose for you. Might have gotten lost if you were strictly looking at like commit counts lines of code. So that can be a pretty interesting augmentation. And you don't necessarily need a tool for that, right? You can just pull out your commit messages and take a look at them and ask it to like know any meaningful insights, such as like maybe your tooling doesn't easily tell you how you have a feeling that there's a lot of overhead going to merging changes across branches, and your tooling doesn't you don't have effective tooling there, so it takes 10 minutes per person, and you quickly grab all the commit messages, and there's some keywording structure that maybe Excel can help you here too, but like OpenAI can give you a first pass super quick. Like, whoop, here's all my commit messages. How many merges are there in there? Oh, I think there's 37 over the last month. Like, great, especially when like you're dealing with something like GitHub. If you're trying to pull that out of GitHub and like it's giving you messages like 27 days ago versus last month versus like which aren't easily interpreted into time series data within a spreadsheet, and then you just give up. Like, before you give up, just try highlighting a bunch of crap and throwing it into AI. Then there's obviously a lot of great tools coming in to make it so you don't have to deal with that. But I think that's the game. Like, any example I give you there's always something that can do it better for you. But before you give up, use AI. It's like pulling stuff out of tables that don't have copy paste. Paste the image in and say, give me this as a table, because I can't copy paste the text out of it. Simple stuff like that. With regards, go ahead.
I was just going to say it's interesting because, and this is a theme that kind of comes up a lot in these conversations, but so we're living in this age of AI and this age of analytics and all that stuff. But what's become even more important, or just as important as ever, is some of the people stuff that we've talked about here, right? Building relationships with your people. You're talked about skip level meetings, having the right culture, a lot of leadership. Those are the things, because I mean, the AI can shine lights on where you're inefficient, can provide analysis, can provide recommendations and insights, but the actual making things better or pushing the business in the right direction is still going to be people doing different things than they were doing before, or changing people processes. And that comes down to, again, relationships, leadership, the right culture, people being empowered, all of those traditional people values that have been around forever. So it's going to always be a combination of those two. And I think those culture and people aspects are going to be probably even more important, even in this age of AI that we're living in today, and all the focus on analytics.
Yeah, I mean, any technical revolution like starts with like some facets of like doomsayers even, but in the end it's just it's a force multiplier that some won't work as effectively, but eventually we'll catch our stride on how to effectively complement and make the things you're talking about even more valuable. Totally. Yeah.
And before we end today's conversation, I want to go back to the very beginning when you share your journey. You mentioned there are a lot of mistakes that you made, and I have a lot of respect for admitting those. And I think every mistake, when you know them, is a learning experience, right? So, any chance at the end of the conversation you can share maybe one mistake that you still remember, either as an engineer or as an engineering leader, with our audience?
Yeah, let's go. One technical, one soft skill. Technical, wiped out production. How'd I do that? I was working at that first startup, and I was like, oh, it was like a series of events. We were joking about how bad the app looked like, I don't know, like a year prior. So I spun up the app as if it was a year prior, when at that time I had like an in-memory database only of what we were working with. And so every time you started the app, it just wiped the data, reseeded it in a way that like, sure, that's what it did, because it wasn't even out in the cloud yet. And then a production incident occurred. And so then here I am on a year-old version of the app, production incident occurs. And I'm like, okay, I got to figure out what's going on in production. I can't debug this. Let me point my local instance to the data store in production and see if I can figure out what's going on by going line by line. So I do that on the 1-year-old version of the app that I have locally. First thing it does is wipe out all the data. And the lesson learned is I have so many different silly steps I take on anything production based now. If I'm doing anything locally, I've got like this, like I've got, like have strategies that are read only, so that you can only ever, like, you have to be very intentional if you're doing something locally to access production level data, that it's like, I have like this like 5-step process with all of these silly steps that are just like kind of a joke to me at this time, with like experiences that emphasize like hot pink on my screen, and like that to let me know like, hey, you're in the danger zone. And then additionally, the biggest benefit I had at that time was I was using a data store as a service. And so that data store was like, yeah, we just ran your backup 1 minute ago. No problem. So I wiped out production, but I lost 1 minute of data. So it was acceptable. If you are not a dev, like if your core competency isn't something like the DevOps aspects of that, like pay for someone else to do it for you, so that when you wipe out production like I did, that it's rapidly fixable, no matter what that may be, so that you can focus on what your product core competency truly is. And I am a very much a buy versus make kind of person whenever possible. So that's the tech side. Try not to wipe out production, but if you do, make sure somebody else is managing the services so that you can get it back. And the soft skill side, I was operating with different operations people at the time, earlier in my career, moving into management, where I had exemplified the ability to influence in evolve organizations. But what I hadn't done as well as my soft skills in effective, like crucial conversations, how to navigate them. So I decided to send an email to somebody that I thought was being less effective, referencing an experience I had with someone else that was more effective, when I did not have that relationship built yet. And not only did I not have that relationship built yet, but like the form was completely wrong. So yes, try to influence positive change, but we're all human. Always consider how you what your end result's going to be, and be thoughtful about how you want to influence it. But then if you're still looking to try to give constructive or critical feedback, always opt for the highest form of communication you possibly can. In person, that's the best. Okay, you can't be in person. It should be like face-to-face video synchronously. You can't do face-to-face, then maybe a phone call, but like work your way down the list on any form of critical feedback. But please shy away from the ruinous empathy of not giving it, because that's not a good answer either.
Awesome. Thank you so
I
much.
think those are the mistakes I think we've all made those mistakes as you get into leadership and people management. It's just like you can read all the books and all the papers and Harvard Business Review articles, but once you get into it, you're still going to make those mistakes, right? You just have to have time in the seat and go through it, and have some of the scars and the bumps and bruises.
Totally.
I have a few final rapid fire questions for you before we end the conversation today.
Yeah.
Are you ready? First, what's your favorite development tool that you can't live without?
State it again.
Sorry. The first question is, what's your favorite development tool that you can't live without?
I gotta go right now. For me, I gotta go to Cursor, especially when exploring something new.
Awesome. Second one, can you recommend a recent book or blog that you came across and found great?
Yeah, I'll say Better Value, Sooner, Safer, Happier. I think it's technically called Sooner, Safer, Happier, but if you search for the full string of Better Value, Sooner, Safer, Happier, it's a great book on really capturing a set of agile-minded, thoughtful principles on effective organizational practices.
Great. Last one. If you could only code in one language for the rest of your life, which one would it be?
Yeah. So being pragmatic and not saying this is my favorite language because it's far from it, and ignoring the difference between TypeScript and JavaScript, I'm just going to have to say JavaScript because it's what the internet's built on. So it's the most likely to be able to be leveraged for whatever my use case is.
It's a very pragmatic
It's not my
choice.
favorite.
Well, with that, thank you very much, Pat, for chatting with us. It's really been a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise. This was a lot of fun. I appreciate you guys taking the time.
Yeah, Pat, it was a blast. Thank you. Thanks for being on with it.